Due to the subject matter, this video contains discussions of racism, sexism, abuse, violence, historical tragedies, and modern tragedies. This video also contains some lighting effects. In its most reductive definition, anti-fascism is simply an opposition to fascism. Anyone opposed to fascism can accurately be called anti-fascist, but anti-fascism is not only something that someone believes, it is something that someone does. It's the difference between theory and praxis, the application of the theory. Anti-fascism is not only the belief that fascism bad, it's a particular form of community organizing, community defense, and political action. Anti-fascist action has enough history that it need not be defined solely by the useful but reductive definition. We can determine what anti-fascism is by its application, its victories, its defeats, its short-term strategy, its overall goals, its efficacy, its supporters and associations, its detractors and enemies. According to arguably the most extensive modern research on the subject by sociologist Stanislav Vysotsky, modern anti-fascism is conducted both informally and formally. Informal anti-fascism is done spontaneously or through a short amount of planning. When fascists come marching through the community to intimidate people and recruit others into their fascist groups, those in the community create an informal and often sudden anti-fascist coalition. This informal coalition confronts the fascists by protesting, shouting them down, or blocking streets, thereby not allowing fascists access to their communities. More formal anti-fascist activity is conducted through small, autonomous organizations with no centralized leadership or official connection to other organizations. These formal anti-fascists remove fascist propaganda from communities, expose the identities of fascists, warn communities about fascist presence, and occasionally engage in more direct confrontation should all else fail. Formal anti-fascists also attend protests, but their presence is different from informal anti-fascists. Formal anti-fascists often wear body armor and other signifiers of who they are. In doing this, they offer themselves as more tempting targets of fascists. This decreases the likelihood that the fascists will attack more vulnerable people in attendance. In this way, formal anti-fascists function as human shields for the community. As an example, in Charlottesville, Virginia, on August 11th and 12th, 2017, an alliance of various neo-fascist, white supremacist, and otherwise right-wing groups organized an event called Unite the Right. This was superficially a rally to protect a Confederate statue, but was more broadly a planned operation to move the window of acceptability to the right, recruit locals to bolster numbers, intimidate minorities in a predominantly white city, and advance the overall cause of fascism. A massive counter-protest emerged. Among those in the counter-protest were both informal and formal anti-fascists. Informal anti-fascists would include everyone in the city who attended the counter-protest, everyone who opposed fascists marching, recruiting, and intimidating in their community. Formal anti-fascist groups, such as Redneck Revolt, were also there as a buffer between the fascists and informal anti-fascists. There is no centralized Antifa. There is only the belief and political position of anti-fascism, informal anti-fascist organizing, and formal anti-fascist organizing. Think of anti-fascism the way one would any other political ideology or individual political position. Political ideologies, as examples liberalism and conservatism, are not organizations. There are autonomous political groups that wish to advance the causes of liberalism and conservatism, and there are liberal and conservative political parties that adhere to these ideologies within a nation. But there is no all-caps liberalism and all-caps conservatism in which they receive their marching orders. Individual political positions similarly have no official, centralized organization either. For example, the issue of reproductive rights has both pro-choice and pro-life sides, and different autonomous organizations that advance their goals, but there is no big pro-choice or big pro-life that has actual codified authority over their respective movements. In the same regard, anti-fascism is the same. It's an ideology or political position depending on your perspective. A key difference, however, is that liberalism and conservatism have mainstream political parties that support their ideologies, and two sides of a single political issue often have massive supporters that can provide significant funding. There is no mainstream political party that centers its ideology specifically around anti-fascism, and there is no major funding for anti-fascist activities. In short, anti-fascism operates within the same parameters of any political ideology or political position, but without much in the way of mainstream public support. A simpler explanation is that anti-fascism is activism. It is activism against fascism. In contrast to a popular misconception, anti-fascist activity does not exacerbate fascist activity. Instead, it limits fascist activity. When fascists organize in one place and anti-fascists organize a much larger counter-protest, one of two outcomes occur. First, the fascists could recognize that this counter-protest will make them unsafe in some way, such as their identities being exposed to the community, and cancel or postpone the fascist rally or event. This has happened many times over the past several years, with fascists realizing that they will be outnumbered and simply not showing up. Second, the fascists could recognize the danger, continue nonetheless, and often end up surrounded by formal and informal anti-fascists. This prevents fascists from being able to march and recruit. It also signals to the community that fascism is unacceptable and that formally joining a fascist organization will come with consequences. At Unite the Right 2 on August 12, 2018 in Washington, D.C., the city turned out in massive numbers for the counter-protest. People outside Washington came for informal anti-fascist support, myself included. This time, the fascists were drowned out and humiliated. The organizer of both, Jason Kessler, has rarely been seen since. Conversely, if fascists organize in tremendous numbers, and there is cause to believe they are armed, informal anti-fascist counter-organizing and even some formal anti-fascist counter-organizing can be minimized out of an abundance of caution. Shortly before the January 6th insurrection, most activist groups in the Washington, D.C. area, meaning Black Lives Matter, autonomous Antifa groups, and others, decided that the situation was too dangerous. These groups warned their formal members and informal supporters to stay home. The insurrectionists were too numerous, too well armed, and you're not going to convince your local anarchist to take a bullet for Mike Pence. Totally understandable. But this should be a good visual lesson about what it looks like when anti-fascists do not show up. When anti-fascists show up, fascists can't do anything. When anti-fascists don't show up, fascists can do anything. Fascists in the midst of a formal terrorist action will not be easily contained by the police. Fascists are often protected by the police, protected by the state, up until the point that fascists threaten the state monopoly of violence. Their informal alliance dissolves, at least temporarily, until the outcome of the fascist incursion. If the outcome is a return to status quo prior to the incursion, their informal alliance begins anew. If the outcome is a new status quo with fascists holding more formal power in government, the alliance is formalized. It is unreasonable to expect the police to take a stronger stand against fascism. Some police officers are simply performing the routines of their duties, nothing more than crowd control, a radical centrist in the face of something that cannot be eliminated by centrism. It is possible for police to arrest fascists, but it is impossible for police to arrest fascism. Therefore, if a fascist performs an illegal act, an officer may choose to arrest him individually, but the police are not there to prevent fascism. Studies conclude that the police are at least 3 times more likely to use force against left-wing protesters than right-wing protesters. The right tries to hand-wave this away by pretending that left-wing protests are somehow more violent and require greater police presence. However, the same studies prove that the police are about 3 times more likely to use force against left-wing protesters, even if the protests are entirely peaceful and not engaged in any illegal activity whatsoever. The right then tries to hand-wave this away by saying that there are simply more left-wing protests, but even accounting for this, the likelihood remains the same. The common denominator is politics. Why is this? Some police officers are sympathetic to the cause of fascism or participate formally in the advancement of fascism. A right-wing false realism exists among police officers, in which the alleged dangers of their occupation justifies brutalizing suspected criminals, over-policing impoverished neighborhoods, harassing minorities, and covering up for the misdeeds of fellow officers, convinced that this is the only way to maintain order, the only way to conduct society. Based on an enormous amount of evidence compiled in recent years, many police officers espouse fascist rhetoric, or are more formally members of fascist groups. While an individual police officer may hold anti-fascist beliefs, it is almost unheard of for a police officer to be a formal member of an autonomous anti-fascist group. The structure of the modern centralized police, as well as its politics and supporters, does not engender anti-fascist politics or left-wing politics among its officers. Police officers can also be the victims of fascist groups, but generally only when police are unwilling to give up their aforementioned authority in the moment. The police are the center and the right, but almost never the left. With these things in mind, it is unreasonable, even absurd, to expect the police to directly oppose fascism for us. That leaves a massive vacancy that needs to be filled in order to prevent fascism. That vacancy is filled by informal and formal organizing among civilians, the people. If society requires something as an absolute necessity, but the state does not invent it, society is forced to invent it themselves to fulfill this requirement. This includes large institutions like charities, smaller actions like mutual aid, formal activist groups, and informal activism. Informal and formal organizing against fascists operates in this capacity, a community solution to an issue that the state either cannot or will not directly address. Anti-Fascism. The positives of anti-fascism generally outweigh the negatives greatly. Fascism, as it is often said, is a cult of strength. Fascists fear humiliation more than anything. When Richard Spencer was struck, the negatives were almost entirely non-existent, except in the minds of 2017-era think piece editorialists.
And then every white liberal came out of the woodworks going, I don't know if that's what we should be doing. Should we really be applauding someone for punching a Nazi? Is that how we want to have political conversation? Shouldn't we hear people out? If you punch a Nazi, it doesn't make you as bad as one. You know what we should do with Nazis? We should debate them, and we should defeat them in the marketplace of ideas. I don't really know where that is. I would like to defeat Nazis on planet Earth first. And then after we eradicate them here, you can fight them in the marketplace of ideas. Narnia, Mordor. Whatever imaginary realm it is that you think Nazis can be constructively debated, go for it, right?
Spencer was recorded not only being struck, but not fighting back. He was recorded retreating. It wasn't the punch, it was the retreat. The positive was the ruination of Richard Spencer's reputation even among fascists. To fascists, he became less credible. He tried to restore his reputation at Unite the Right later that year, but that did not go well either. Spencer became more and more afraid to attend and organize fascist rallies, and by the end of the year he was a non-factor in the alt-right movement that he coined and popularized. Fascism, historically, requires charismatic leaders. Humiliating their leaders removes that threat and prevents that requirement from being fulfilled. Whether or not it is right to put your hands on a fascist is between you and your God. Whether or not anti-fascism is effective is less disputable. In modern times, most anti-fascist activity is conducted within the law, but formal anti-fascist groups recognize that the threat of fascism is so great that acts of civil disobedience may be necessary. So, what do anti-fascists hope to accomplish? Anti-fascist activity aims to disrupt fascist organizing, protect communities from fascist violence, and most importantly, prevent fascism from ever again becoming a mainstream, legitimized political ideology. Those who disagree with anti-fascist activity claim that we must show extraordinary tolerance, even for intolerance. However, tolerance for intolerance is not so much an argument as it is wordplay. Tolerance for intolerance would be better described as appeasement, making concessions to the aggressor or instigator. Europe knows how well appeasement worked in the past. We do not believe in the principle of tolerance in the abstract, as if it were some ethereal, untouchable quality. We believe in the principle of tolerance because of the broader belief that it's a component in creating a peaceful society in which we can all hopefully coexist. Fascism opposes tolerance, opposes coexisting. Therefore, opposing fascism does not violate the principle of tolerance, but appeasing fascism does violate the principle of tolerance. In the attempt to hold true to the principle has instead been violated. This is not a matter of some exception to the principle either. Instead, opposing fascism does not violate this principle at all. Those who disagree with this assessment often say, "You wouldn't like it if people were hostile to your political ideology." Yeah, nobody would, but what does that mean in this case? That we should allow fascism to lay down its bedrock, march and recruit without opposition, grow to some unmanageable size, and exterminate people because that would be more fair? Fair to whom? Certainly not the people fascists wish to exterminate. So let's not say things like that. Anti-fascism operates under the belief that fascism is so unacceptable that it is illegitimate as a political ideology, that it is so far outside what any reasonable person could consider good or right that it should not be considered a legitimate option or part of legitimate political discourse. In this case, legitimate and illegitimate do not only mean right and wrong respectively. Fascism is illegitimate in the sense that it is unworthy of consideration, and allowing it any legitimacy is inherently dangerous to human beings. Fascists and their apologists might respond, "Oh yeah? Well, who gets to decide what is legitimate and illegitimate?" Well, let's interrogate that. A political ideology is a set of related ethics and ideas that form a cultural blueprint for a society. The implication of this cultural blueprint is that this would be the best possible option for everyone in society. That is the foundation of this cultural blueprint. Fascism adheres to deeply divided supremacist hierarchies of race, nationality, religion, gender, sexuality, and more. The unavoidable consequence of supremacist hierarchies is the monstrous subjugation and dehumanization of people within those hierarchies. Therefore, fascism is an illegitimate ideology because its inherent supremacist hierarchies absolutely cannot be the best solution for everyone by its own design. For example, a supremacist hierarchy of race cannot possibly be the best solution for everyone except for whoever the fascists believe is the superior race. The supremacist hierarchies of fascism are expressly designed to subjugate people. It is not simply a matter of opinion or personal moral objection. It is the inescapable consequence of these hierarchies. If a political ideology requires a foundation for its cultural blueprint, and fascism has none, then it is not a legitimate ideology. We can still call it an ideology as shorthand, I certainly have in the past, but fascism is far more like dogma, a set of beliefs so rigid that they cannot possibly coexist with other beliefs. Even oppositional ideologies can be debated on similar terms because of the, at least alleged goal of both, to create a better society. Not all political ideologies are equal simply because they have legitimacy, and some are outright ludicrous. However, we can argue against almost any ideology without removing the legitimacy of the ideology, so long as the cultural blueprint has some semblance of a foundational plan. We can argue and debate about what is built on top of the foundation. For example, I am personally opposed to conservatism, but I do not ascribe quite the same illegitimacy to it as I would fascism. I think its cultural blueprint is wrong and flawed, but it still contains the minimum standard, an argument about why it would be best for everyone. We can argue that on the same terms. Fascism is not illegitimate simply because it's radical. There is a difference between politics that are merely outside the mainstream purely by comparison, and dogma that is outside the confines of legitimacy due to its lack of foundation. In short, fascism has no foundation and should not be treated as if it did. For most sensible people, this explanation about anti-fascism and legitimacy is more than enough, and if you were looking for some explainer video under 20 minutes and feel completely satisfied, you can leave now before we get to the good stuff. Still here? Great. Now, illegitimate is not a word commonly used to describe a political ideology, because we live in what we at least tell ourselves is a free and fair society. We do not. There is far too much inequality for that to be true, but we at least share the principle of either wanting the society that we claim we live in, or for some of us, wanting an even better society. Those who believe we actually currently do live in a free and fair society, despite evidence to the contrary, sometimes hold this belief so close that they do not recognize when a political ideology is illegitimate. The broader concept of free and fair allows them to hold a cognitive dissonance, two conflicting contradictory ideas: that fascism is as illegitimate as anything else that causes enormous harm and has no offsetting benefits, and that fascism must still be tolerated in our communities to maintain the illusion that our society is free and fair. They claim that if we do not at least pretend that every belief system is a legitimate political ideology, provide a platform for every so-called ideology, and encourage it to grow as much as it wants, then our free and fair society will collapse. It's the slippery slope argument, and there is a reason why it's a common logical fallacy. Society has opposed fascism directly in war, then directly through anti-fascist activity throughout the second half of the 20th century, and is currently opposing fascism in the 21st century. Apologists would then argue that that's still not the point, and that even though anti-fascism has no other consequence except less fascism in the world, anti-fascism still violates their more abstract principle about their free and fair society that does not actually exist. Principles exist to be applied in the real world, not to be tallied in our minds on some invisible scorecard. Your principle about tolerating fascism applied to the real world is an existential threat to real human beings, and has historically always resulted in unimaginable catastrophes. Now, how the state should view fascism is not exactly my purview. Anti-fascist organizing is community organizing, not a function of the state, and the community need not accept fascism as legitimate. To sum up, if fascism is illegitimate, then anti-fascism is legitimate. It provides a necessary requirement for a community under the threat of fascism when there is a vacancy of support that the state refuses to fill. In a crisis, we have to help each other. Now wait a minute, you might think. Is fascism so bad that it needs this kind of response? Alright, well, perhaps a more thorough explanation of the particulars of fascism will answer that question. I have defined this in a previous video, but it seems I need to go harder. My apologies for any redundancies. Fascism is far-right ultranationalism that evokes a mythic past to justify traditional hierarchies of people in a nation. Said nation is reborn under this traditional hierarchy, and the myth is made manifest. British political theorist Roger Griffin called it palingenetic populist ultranationalism. A simple dictionary definition is not enough, though, so let's use history as our definition instead. Fascism views the stratified economic and social classes created by culture and reframes them as nature, the natural order, the way things ought to be. For example, to fascists, a racial minority in a nation is subject to the whims and control of the majority because of the natural order, not because of unfair discrimination, exploitation for profit, or how poverty has been racialized throughout history. To fascists, women are subject to the whims and control of men because of the natural order, not because of millennia of antiquated systems and physical intimidation. These hierarchies exist to control or eliminate those who the fascists consider degenerates, undesirables who threaten the sanctity of the nation, not by their actions or their contributions, but by their continued existence. It's not as simple as hate, the catch-all term for the attitudes of fascists and those who share similar beliefs. Fascism does not only seek to hate, but to control. If those lower on these hierarchies serve a meaningful purpose to fascists, such as women, they must remain but must also be controlled. Fascists often say that they love their wives, but only as long as they serve the husband from a lower point on the hierarchy. Now, if those lower on the hierarchies do not serve a meaningful purpose to fascists, such as religious minorities, then they must be either marginalized so greatly that their quality of life completely vanishes, deported from the nation, or exterminated altogether. If there is one lesson to take from this entire video, it is this: fascist hierarchies do not allow for coexistence. Fascism is a dogma and a movement, but not a form of government. A government can be described as fascist the same way a government can be described as liberal or conservative, depending on which party is in power, but the form of government remains the same. A form of government is its shape: monarchy, democracy, and so forth. An ideology or dogma can influence the inner workings of the government and sometimes even change the makeup of the government, but it is not a form of government all on its own. A fascist group is still a fascist group even if it does not currently hold power in government, or even if it has not yet changed the structure of government. That's because what makes it a fascist group is its fascist dogma, its beliefs, not its current hold on power. For example, a conservative politician is still a conservative even if there is a liberal president. Defining fascism as if it were simply a threshold in which a regime achieves fascism in government would be a mistake. We do not have to live under fascism to be surrounded by fascists. Fascists practice obscurantism, the presentation of ideas that are meant to conceal the truth. Fascist obscurantism seeks to conceal their less palatable goals in service of advancing those goals. In modern times, fascists use different terms to describe themselves besides fascist, but it's all a three-card Monty confidence game. They almost never show you the card that says fascist or Nazi, and instead show you the card that says European identitarian, or Western chauvinist, or ethno-nationalist. Today, most fascists do not openly declare themselves fascists, and instead operate under this obscurantism, commonly called crypto-fascism. This crypto-fascism is held together through deceptive rhetoric and talking points espoused by crypto-fascists and their apologists. For example, social media bots and some allegedly real people say, "Fascism is left-wing." I was hesitant to even include this, as it is such a ludicrous statement that it might give the impression I am straw-manning the opposition, because the idea that far-right politics are secretly left-wing is so illegitimate that it is laughable. Nevertheless, this is something that some people seemingly believe, or at least pretend to believe to deflect criticism of the right. This argument is born primarily from a misunderstanding of what the left and the right actually are. In the United States, for example, conservative rhetoric has confused the makeup of the political spectrum and has given many people the impression that the left is when the government does stuff, and that the more stuff the government does, the more left it is. This is neither the origin of the left-right naming convention, nor is it applicable today. At the risk of being similarly reductive, the conflict between what we consider the left and the right is between equality and hierarchy, respectively. Egalitarian politics endorse a society in which people are treated equally, receive equal rights, equal protection, and so forth. Hierarchical politics endorse the opposite. We see this every time a right-wing pundit denounces diversity. It's not as simple as that, though. Leftists differ greatly in how much equality they wish to propose. For example, social democrats propose a mixed economy with a strong public safety net, but social democracy still essentially operates under capitalism, an economic hierarchy. Much further to the left, anarchists propose a society free of any coercive hierarchy, including but not limited to the abolition of capitalism. There are other varieties of leftists in between, and this disparity among leftists causes anarchists to claim that SocDems are not truly part of the left, and causes SocDems to claim that anarchists are unrealistic and that some coercive hierarchies are necessary. So, why does the right sometimes claim that the left is when the government does stuff? Some on the left wish to use the government to make more of our utilities and programs that ensure greater equality publicly owned instead of privately owned by corporations. This is, at least in theory, in service of greater equality, not the vague concept of the government doing stuff. This is not universal, however, especially considering that anarchism, which is among the furthest left positions, is directly opposed to the very existence of what we presently consider the state. Anarchists also wish to provide for the people, but through a society that, from the ground up, is without want, without poverty. Furthermore, considering how consistently leftists of all stripes oppose the authority of the state, such as state violence conducted by the police and imperialism conducted by the military, the idea that the left is intrinsically tied to a powerful state is absurd. That is not the common denominator among the left. The common denominator is egalitarianism, not when the government does stuff. Many on the right would claim that they too believe in equality, but a limited equality, an equality of opportunity. This is the position of modern conservatism and classical liberalism. As explained by Robert O. Paxton, author of The Anatomy of Fascism, classical liberals interpreted liberty as individual personal freedom, preferring limited constitutional government and a laissez-faire economy to any kind of state intervention, whether mercantilist, as in the early 19th century, or socialist, as later on. Equality they understood as opportunity made accessible to talent by education. They accepted inequality of achievement and hence of power and wealth. Unfortunately, because of the economic hierarchy as well as social hierarchies that the right would prefer not to address, this so-called equality of opportunity does not really result in anything even resembling equality in practice. Everyone has the opportunity to apply for a job, but not everyone will be offered that job. It's not a race if some people get a head start. This is the position of modern garden variety conservatives and many liberals, because modern liberalism is a centrist position and absolutely not the left. Every so often, I explain what everyone already knows, that capitalism is part of liberalism, and that liberals do not want to abolish capitalism, and some conservative responds that liberals are communists because they don't know what liberalism means, and some liberal also says, well, I call myself a liberal and I'm anti-capitalist. Well, congratulations, my dude. You're not a liberal, you're a leftist. If you have progressive social values and you want capitalism to be replaced, that's not liberalism. It's to the left of liberalism. You just thought that because you're probably an American who has been told that liberalism is further to the left than it actually is. Totally understandable. I was like that when I was young too. No shame. Welcome to the club. Here are some introductory books that may interest you. Much further to the right of garden variety conservatives are fascists. Fascism is quite possibly the most hierarchical political dogma ever devised, and is therefore an extremely far-right position. Some who consider themselves leftists may in fact be racist or sexist, of course. These are pervasive attitudes that have been so ingrained in both the culture and laws of even nominally egalitarian nations. But fascism itself, as a set of beliefs and as a movement, is unmistakably right-wing. it's possible to combine right-wing ultranationalism, fascism, with a few nominally left-wing values the way Nazbols do, but the fascism part of it and fascism itself is still right-wing. That's just the way it is. Fascists are so far to the right that they even consider liberalism the far left, and have historically despised both liberalism and ideologies to its left, socialism, anarchism, etc. The right sometimes even claims that the Nazis were socialists because of their name and some of their early rhetoric. However, borrowing popular left-wing naming conventions was, and still is, a common tactic of obscurantism. What matters is what they did, not what they called themselves. It's particularly galling and even offensive to consider the Nazis actual socialists, considering how many actual German socialists they exterminated. Nazis were not socialists. Nazis put socialists in concentration camps. The left is about egalitarianism, and there was nothing egalitarian about Nazi Germany. The right sometimes claims that fascism had its origins in the left because Benito Mussolini was raised as a socialist before converting to fascism. Yet, the admission within this bad argument kind of gives up the game, right? Because if Mussolini abandoned his previous left-wing beliefs and became a fascist, then fascism is not left-wing, but the complete abandonment of left-wing ideology. Also, who cares what he used to be? It's not really relevant. His left-wing beliefs were not even molded into fascism. It's a completely different set of beliefs that have little, if anything, to do with one another. That's why they're on opposite ends of the political compass. The left is about egalitarianism, and there was nothing egalitarian about Mussolini's eventual dogma of fascism. Fascist obscurantists present a superficial conception of post-World War I Italy. Any historian worth their salt knows that Italian fascism used left-wing vocabulary to advance right-wing goals, laying the groundwork for future fascist movements like the Nazis to do the same. Mussolini even called socialists parasites, and his fascist party directly opposed them in elections and in the streets. Mussolini's fascist black shirts tortured and murdered hundreds of socialists in 1921 alone. Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti made an uneasy alliance with Mussolini and eventually legitimized fascism in order to combat socialism and other parties. When Mussolini stepped down as leader of the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento, he founded the National Fascist Party and loudly rejected any previous association with socialism. Once in power, Mussolini no longer required the pretense of superficially left-wing rhetoric. Fascist Italy practicing different economic models during their short reign, including corporatism, does not do much to change fascism's far-right social politics, far-right social hierarchies, far-right nationalism, or far-right goals. In modern times, we should all be familiar with the disparity between campaign promises and the eventual actions and inactions of an administration. If you believe fascism is left-wing, then you are either falling for century-old fascist propaganda, or you are purposefully spreading fascist propaganda. Both are bad. Don't do that. The idea that the far left and the far right are one and the same is not an argument with any historical merit. It's a Simpsons joke.
Big Bang to base, under attack by commie Nazis.
Many American fascists say, we can't be fascists because we're not all white. But fascism historically does not require exclusively white people, nor is it always founded exclusively in race. That is usually a pretty big part of it, but there are other factors, be they based in religion, gender, sexuality, nationality, etc. Furthermore, fascists historically recruit a limited portion of the racial and religious minorities that they hope to oppress, both for practical reasons and for propagandistic reasons. Unfortunately, in every movement that targets a group of people, there are some collaborators from that group who believe that assimilation and appeasement will provide them with safety or even status. Some even mistakenly believe they are genuinely part of the fascist in-group, but they are only pawns that are historically sacrificed once fascists have achieved enough of their goals and no longer require collaborators from the outgroup. Bear in mind that only a small fraction of the outgroup would ever be willing to be collaborators in their own oppression. The marginalized outgroup more broadly is still the victim, and the fascist in-group is still the perpetrator. American fascists say, "We can't be fascists because we love the United States, and the United States fought the fascists in World War II." Citizenship does not exclude someone from a political ideology, and there are a great many overt and openly fascist groups in the United States. Now more than ever, nationalistic pride in the United States does not prevent fascism, as fascism is historically built upon nationalism. The ultranationalism inherent in fascism manifests somewhat differently depending on the nation. American fascists do not have to wave a swastika to be a fascist because their symbols might be more relevant to their own nation and their own sense of nationalism. Furthermore, while this is a common argument among crypto-fascists, more openly fascist groups in the United States do not use this argument as they more publicly identify with the ideologies of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy during World War II. These are common bad arguments specific to recent American fascists, but fascists, regardless of their nation of origin, have other similar bad arguments. Fascists, and their unwitting apologists, often say, "If you look up fascism in the dictionary," and then they quote one of the dozen or so definitions of fascism to prove that fascists are not fascists. Okay, look, people who have never read any books about fascism love to do this in the internet comment sections and social media. Basically territory in which brevity is king and discussion has character limits. One sentence explaining a complex set of beliefs with a history of obscuring its own dogma is a poor argument coming from an incomplete definition. Each dictionary defines fascism somewhat differently anyway. Apologists for fascism always seem to search for the shortest and least descriptive definition, and their motives for doing this are transparent. Different fascist movements throughout history have had different qualities, but they are still distinctly fascist due to having enough family resemblance. As Umberto Eco once said, "One can eliminate from a fascist regime one or more features, and it will still be recognizable as fascist. Take away imperialism from fascism, and you still have Franco and Salazar. Take away colonialism, and you still have the Balkan fascism of the Ustashis." Because of this, attempting to locate an ideal-typical fascism is nigh impossible. If no fascism is ideal-typical, then discounting a form of fascism for not being ideal-typical would discount all fascism from being fascism. This would even discount the most unambiguous historical instances of fascism. That is patently absurd and is more wordplay than logical argument. Put more simply, fascism is best defined in history books and political science books, not dictionaries. Apologists and those who are simply unlearned on the subject sometimes say, "Do you really think all these people have been reading about fascist beliefs?" Many modern fascists have not done much of the reading on the subject outside of underground message boards. This allows themselves an idiot defense, both internally among fascists and externally from their apologists. Some undoubtedly have read fascist texts, such as the Turner Diaries and books about so-called scientific racism, but most have simply adopted these fascist beliefs through more blunt and unexamined prejudices, adhering to these beliefs predominantly by shouting related catchphrases that serve as both slogan and the entirety of their understanding. Fascism is not an intellectual ideology. It is a dogma of fear, misplaced anger, and insecurity. Gut feelings, not education. The claim that someone is too ignorant to be a fascist suffers from the false premise that fascism is somehow a logical ideology commonly adopted through rational thought and higher education, and that is ridiculous. Apologists quibble over details and terminology to obfuscate the larger issues. Fascism and Nazism are different. Yes, in the sense that the British Conservative Party and the Conservative Party of Canada are different, but they are both made up of Tories. Historians almost universally designate Nazism as a form of fascism. The Nazi Party and Italy's Fascist Party contained some characteristics distinct from one another, but both were nonetheless forms of fascism because of the root beliefs and goals of both, the aforementioned family resemblance. Differences between them do not reinforce the idea that one is somehow not fascism. This is because fascism aims to return a nation to its mythical former glory, and due to this, A fascist movement in one nation will have some unique immediate goals, as well as qualities and symbols that are not seen in a fascist movement in another nation. Nazism is a distinct form of fascism within fascism more broadly. Then, they say, we still shouldn't call modern fascists Nazis if they're kinda not Nazis. The distinction between neo-fascist groups and distinctly neo-Nazi groups is helpful when investigating them. Nevertheless, it is unhelpful when warning the public about the threat of fascism to avoid the word Nazi as a pejorative or as shorthand. Therefore, it is reasonable to draw this distinction internally among anti-fascist movements, investigative journalism, and criminal investigations, but unreasonable when there is a need to quickly communicate a threat. It is especially unreasonable to avoid Nazi comparisons to spare the feelings of fascists. Yes, we should be accurate about terminology in the descriptive sense, but we should not be afraid to use this term in the pejorative sense, regardless of minutiae that is only meaningful between various fascist groups. Your well actually about this is only helpful to fascists. Next, apologists come up with odd scenarios and false equivalencies. If we break this non-existent handshake deal we have with fascists, then and only then will the fascists strike. First, anti-fascism does not provoke fascism. It is conducted after fascism has already emerged. Second, we don't have a social contract with fascists. Fascists are not playing the same game we are. We're playing baseball. They're playing Calvin ball, and they adhere to no rules. We don't have a social contract with someone or something that is trying to murder us. What about talking to fascists and de-radicalizing them? An individual fascist can see the light and abandon their fascist beliefs, especially if they're not in too deep yet, but it must be understood that due to its limitations, de-radicalizing fascists cannot be the only tactic. A fascist marching in the streets, shouting anti-Semitic slogans, is almost definitely not someone who can be approached politely and given a pamphlet about the better angels of their nature. If you try to silence fascists, that's censorship. Yeah, cool. Cool argument. If you scramble to the dictionary to define censorship in the broadest possible terms, you can claim that any instance in which someone is not provided a megaphone is somehow censorship. However, that does not interrogate why censorship is generally reviled. Censorship is reviled because of the power dynamics involved and the potential for truth to be ignored. For example, if the state censors someone for making reasonable criticisms about a government policy, the outrage about this censorship is that someone was speaking truth to power, and a far more omnipresent entity stifled that truth for its own selfish reasons. By contrast, in the conflict between the people and fascism, the fascists are not speaking truth, and the people are not subjugating fascists, but protecting themselves from fascists. We can determine when someone is being silenced for speaking the truth and when someone is simply being booed by the people. Booing a fascist and shutting them down is simply community defense. Not all speech is protected. We can't sexually harass people at work. We can't make terroristic threats in public. We can't shout fire in a crowded theater. We can't call someone on the phone and blackmail them. We can't commit perjury. We can't frame someone for a crime with a false statement. We can't incite violence. This is not simply a concern of law, it is a concern of society. Exceptions exist not when they conflict with our personal politics, but when the speech is pointed enough and targeted enough to be directly infringing upon the rights of others. Sometimes the fundamental right to exist. We have generally agreed to this as a society, but we sometimes forget that when someone shouts, "Free speech, censorship," after any instance of someone not getting their way. Then, apologists say, we should just ignore the fascists. Ignoring a threat does not solve the threat. An instruction to ignore fascism endorses fascism as normal. Ignoring fascists while they hold court in the city only denies them your attention. The attention of someone who presumably would not be interested in fascism anyway. It does not deny them the attention of those who would be interested in fascism. Publicly opposing fascism disincentivizes people from joining because of the consequences. Fascists only fear consequences, not the pangs of their conscience. Confronting fascists in the streets is not giving them what they want, because fascists want and need normalization far more than confrontation. Any mild negative consequences of exposing fascism is nothing compared to the overwhelming negative consequences of ignoring fascism and hoping it goes away. Furthermore, it is a position of great privilege to be able to ignore fascists. Not everyone is so lucky to be able to simply look the other way. Then they say, even if you consider it self-defense, that makes you as bad as a fascist. Self-defense, or the defense of others, requires some action and is usually justifiable. For example, if a serial killer is chasing a woman down the street, using a small amount of violence to tackle him does not make you as bad as the serial killer. In fact, it doesn't make you bad at all. This is not a two wrongs don't make a right situation, because it was right to tackle the serial killer. There was only one wrong, and it was committed by the hypothetical serial killer. We all intuitively understand this, but propaganda that demonizes anti-fascism makes us forget it. If you think it's not justifiable because you mistakenly believe that anti-fascists are doing the things that Fox News says they're doing, stay tuned for that to be debunked in a later section. When their allegedly best arguments are put down, apologists resort to more ridiculous rhetoric. I guess Antifa doesn't like other people's opinions. Fascism is not an opinion. It's an existential threat, and the consequences are too severe to categorize it the same way you would categorize more innocuous opinions. Your favorite pizza topping is an opinion. Fascism is fascism. Reducing fascism to just an opinion is both offensive and ignorant. Well, Winston Churchill said, "No, he did not." That is a fake quote, and even if he had, that would not change anything substantive about fascism or anti-fascism. The fake Churchill quote is weaponized to put down anti-fascist arguments by falsely labeling anti-fascists as fascists. With these intentions in mind, we should be suspicious of the politics and motivations of those who display these quotes in the discourse about fascism. But what if we could stop fascism only by talking about it? Yeah, and what if the world were made of pudding? It's difficult to engage with a question that we both know is not true. Absurd hypotheticals are unhelpful, especially now that we are well past the point of the hypothetical. I'm just asking questions. No, you're not. Nobody is just asking questions about Nazis. There certainly has been a whole lot of people defending Nazis hypothetically, hasn't there? You're not fooling anyone. The ultimate goal of fascists is a state that endorses their dogma and is controlled by fascists, but their immediate goal is always in service of mainstreaming their dogma. Otherwise, their subsequent goals cannot be accomplished. Fascists do not need to convince 51% of the population that fascism is preferable to the status quo. Fascists instead only need to convince the nation that those who do support fascism are legitimate, that fascism is legitimate, and that the goals of fascism are not extreme, but mainstream, or at least mainstream enough to be left alone. Fascists do not only gain power by recruiting new fascists, they gain power by convincing centrists and other uninterested parties that fascist goals are ordinary enough, that fascism is either no cause for concern, or that concerns about fascism must never exceed the polite norms of civil discourse. This position sounds absurd, because it is, but it's the position that a tremendous amount of people adopt in the face of fascism, albeit not always consciously. In micro terms, not every individual instance of a fascist and an anti-fascist encountering one another has the fascist physically strike or sabotage first. But in macro terms, due to the order of operation of fascism emerging and anti-fascism following this emergence, anti-fascism is never the aggressor in this conflict, but is always acting in self-defense. How has that happened over the course of history? Let's take our more directed and focused criticism of fascism and zoom out to see the larger picture. During World War I, Italy fought on the side of the Allied powers with the British Empire, France, the United States, and others. The special assault units of the Italian army were known as the Arditi, the daring ones. As their name suggests, the Arditi led daring assaults, leaping into enemy trenches with daggers, killing the occupants and holding the trench until the more traditional soldiers could arrive. After the war, many Arditi joined with Mussolini's nascent movement in hopes of better post-war treatment for veterans by the state. However, once it became clear that Mussolini had no actual socialist aims and was moving toward fascism, many former Arditi were disgusted, seeing fascism as a betrayal of their politics, their principles, and the Italian people in general. This was not what they fought for. A schism emerged among the former Arditi. Those who opposed Mussolini formed what many consider the first anti-fascist organization, Arditi del Popolo, the People's Daring Ones. Not everyone who joined this anti-fascist movement were former Arditi, but they had an entitlement to the name, as the Arditi del Popolo was co-founded and inspired by Argo Secondari, a lieutenant in the battalion of the Arditi and one of the founders of the National Association of the Arditi. Secondari, an anarchist, led perhaps the first large-scale anti-fascist rally on July 6, 1921. Approximately 2,000 anti-fascists marched with him. According to the book Fascism, Anti-Fascism, and the Resistance in Italy, by the end of the summer, more than 20,000 Italians joined Arditi del Popolo, establishing 144 sections. The Arditi del Popolo defended the cities from the fascist blackshirts at every turn. Fascists and the police were both overpowered by them, and the defeat of fascism seemed certain. Tragically, when the fascists were at their most vulnerable, one of the political parties in Italy, the Italian Socialist Party, signed a treaty of non-aggression with the fascists, forcing any anti-fascists belonging to this party to abandon Arditi del Popolo. Overnight, the anti-fascist movement had been reduced from 20,000 to 6,000. This truce, of course, was a ruse by the fascists. A month following the truce, fascists in the town of Piombino burned down the offices of the Italian Socialist Party. The National Fascist Party now had the numbers and were able to overwhelm and exterminate the anti-fascists. Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti did not attempt to stop this, nor did he attempt to stop violent fascist takeovers of regional governments. Giolitti created a right-wing coalition with the fascists and the liberals in hopes of putting an end to left-wing politics in the nation, particularly the labor movement. In October 1922, Mussolini organized a coup d'etat. Fascists marched on Rome, and King Victor Emmanuel II declared Mussolini the new prime minister. Fascists only care about coalitions until they have enough power to make their move. Fascism is too rigidly hierarchical to simply coexist with anything else. Once Mussolini was in power, he began a policy of Italianization, an assimilation program that amounted to cultural genocide, targeting those deemed outside of Italian ethnicity or Italian culture. The National Fascist Party banned the languages of Slavic citizens, shut down their schools, changed their names to appear Italian, and sent thousands of Slavic citizens to Italy's version of concentration camps. The National Fascist Party formed the Organization for Vigilance and Repression of Anti-Fascism, a secret police designed to repress and murder anti-fascists. Anti-fascism had its best opportunity before Mussolini took power. Once in power, anti-fascist activities were monumentally more challenging. In 1935, Fascist Italy invaded Ethiopia. In 1936, Italy sent 70,000 ground troops and military equipment to support the fascists in the Spanish Civil War. In 1940, Italy declared war on France and the United Kingdom. Following the fall of Italian fascism, Nazi Germany quickly occupied Italy. In response, a coalition of anti-fascists and communists formed a resistance movement, and after 2 years, both the Nazis and Italian fascists were defeated. Although the Italian anti-fascist movement did not prevent the rise of fascism in Italy, it was able to remove the fascist threat. If the Italian Socialist Party had not been taken in by the fascist ruse of the Non-Aggression Pact, fascism may not have taken hold in Italy at all. Let's move on to Germany. In 1920, the far-right nationalist German Workers' Party held a committee and changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. Adolf Hitler, an executive for the DAP, objected to the word socialist, as the party was anything but. However, the rest of the committee believed it would appeal to workers outside of the far right and hide their actual intentions. A common rhetorical tactic. All members and spouses of members had to be racially pure Aryans, and those who defied this were condemned and sometimes killed. In the following years, Hitler became inspired by Mussolini and Italian fascism, adopting many of its policies, rhetoric, and symbols, including the Roman salute. Following the fascist march on Rome in October 1922, Hitler began planning his own coup d'état, the infamous Beer Hall Putsch of November 1923. While unsuccessful, the trial allowed Hitler national attention and was almost acquitted due to the pro-Nazi politics of the lay judges. The presiding judge was comparatively less forgiving, but still only sentenced him to a mere 5 years for high treason. Hitler was nonetheless afforded comfortable accommodations in prison and was allowed to dictate Mein Kampf, which popularized his far-right politics further among the German population. Hitler served only 9 months of his 5-year sentence. Nazis ramped up anti-Semitic and anti-communist violence, intimidating some of the population while energizing the rest. The Beer Hall Putsch was a coup attempt of only about 2,000 Nazis, but by 1928, the party had more than 60,000 Nazis. Leftists in Germany commonly used taverns to organize, but once the Nazis had enough financial backing from business interests, they bought most leftist taverns in Berlin and transformed the taverns into Nazi bases. A combination of Hitler's light sentence, his early release, and the sale of their bases of operation finally convinced the left that the state was unwilling to properly assess and confine the threat of fascism. Enter anti-fascist action. Although there were anti-fascist resistance movements in Germany prior to this, such as Iron Front and others, anti-fascist action was by far the most organized and the most willing to perform extra-legal activities to stop encroaching fascism. Anti-fascist action was a cross-section of different groups: the Communist Party of Germany, the paramilitary alliance of Red Front fighters, and Red Mass self-defense. Anti-fascist action began in May 1932. Tragically, less than a year later, in January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor, making anti-fascism more important than ever. Much like Italian Prime Minister Giovanni Gioletti's alliance with Benito Mussolini, the more traditional right-leaning parties believed that bringing Hitler into the government more properly and more legitimately would soften him and force his fascist party to become more moderate. Much as it was with the Italian fascists, the alliance with the German fascists only strengthened fascism, mainstreamed fascism, which is always its goal. A few weeks after Hitler became Chancellor, an arson at the Reichstag that was, let's say, convenient for the Nazis, allowed Hitler to claim that the German people were under attack by communism. He demanded and received emergency powers. Anti-fascist action fought back, but a combination of their late arrival to the scene, infighting, and the sheer numbers of the opposition caused the group to scatter before the end of 1933. Armed paramilitary anti-fascism was far more challenging and infinitely more dangerous once fascism and the state had merged together. Some fascist movements in other nations around this time were less successful, and this was due in no small part to anti-fascist organizing. When Mussolini came to power in 1922 and began exterminating communists and anarchists, business owners in other nations sometimes saw fascism as a potential weapon against the rising left and workers' rights. The United Kingdom nearly descended into fascism as well. An organization called British Fascisti emerged, claiming inspiration from Mussolini. Fascists in this organization were mostly landed gentry, military men, and upper-class women. The British Fascisti were strikebreakers, often assaulting labor organizers. In response, the first anti-fascist organizations in the United Kingdom were formed in 1924. The Communist Party of Great Britain started the People's Defence Force, and a writer named Ethel Kearney Holdsworth founded the National Union for Combating Fascism. In one notorious incident, fascists kidnapped Harry Pollitt, a member of the Communist Party. All 5 fascists were found not guilty after erroneously claiming that they were only taking Mr. Pollitt on holiday. In 1925, an even more violent fascist group emerged, the National Fascisti. Armed members of National Fascisti hijacked a newspaper van containing copies of a pro-Labor Party newspaper. They crashed the van into church property, but somehow received a fairly light sentence. Imagine that. Fearful that the state would continue to favor the fascists or do nothing, anti-fascists joined forces with trade unionists and struck the British Fascisti and National Fascisti, disrupting their meetings, countering their strike-breaking operations, and sabotaging their political overtures to have a role in government. In 1931, Sir Oswald Mosley formed a political party called New Party to oppose the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. Mosley organized a paramilitary wing called the Biff Boys and eventually formally adopted fascism. Mosley even visited Mussolini in Italy and met with high-ranking Nazis in Germany. With an actual fascist political party running in elections, the other fascist groups saw this as an opportunity. Mosley subsumed all the fascists under the banner of the British Union of Fascists. Membership continued to grow until anti-fascists took the fight to them, and the violence dissuaded its middle-class members from remaining in the group. Once marginalized and diminished, the government was able to criminalize membership in the British Union of Fascists without any repercussions. The United Kingdom no longer faced a fascist threat from within, but due to Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement, the UK faced a fascist threat from outside its borders. There were a number of other fascist movements during this period leading up to World War II. Some found their way into power, such as the Ustash movement in Croatia, and some were held back by anti-fascists and legal mandates, such as the National Radical Camp in Poland and the German-American Bund in the United States. There are so many more examples. The popular consciousness of fascism in the first half of the 20th century only recalls Italy and Germany, but fascists were everywhere. The success of a fascist movement during this time was largely dependent on its opposition. The willingness of the people to view fascism as an existential threat and to treat it as such. Anti-fascism works best when preventing the ascent of fascism, preventing fascism from becoming the predominant force in government. Should that effort fail, the full force of the state, combined with the ruthlessness of fascism, makes resistance that much harder. Anti-fascist resistance movements operated in Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Denmark, Greece, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, and more. These movements were helpful, but obviously an anti-fascist movement that prevents the rise of fascism in the first place is always preferable. So, what have we learned from these examples? Making peace with fascist movements does not actually create peace in the nation. Peace is preferable to conflict, of course, but fascists do not want peace. A temporary, conditional truce is a ruse. A public statement about a commitment to nonviolence by a fascist is a lie. These are simply tactics that allow them to buy time. Even crypto-fascists who hide from the word fascist generally endorse fascism's unmovable, rigid hierarchies of race, religion, nationality. Because of their unmovable hierarchies, fascism's goal can never be coexistence. It can only be supremacy. Following World War II, anti-fascists learned this hard lesson and organized to prevent the nightmare of fascism from ever emerging again. As Nazi Germany surrendered, anti-fascist groups re-emerged. Post-war Antifa. Whenever West Germans saw the government considering a potential move to the right, Antifa organized. And whenever Germans saw fascist groups whisper about a return to the old ways, Antifa mobilized. This continues to this day. In the United Kingdom, fascist groups were re-energized almost immediately after the war. This would continue for decades. Fascist groups would emerge, and the English would form anti-fascist groups to marginalize them so that their ideas would not spread. This happened everywhere, throughout Europe, North America, Australia, everywhere. Fascism never rose to greater prominence in the second half of the 20th century, but it was not because the nations of the world and the people of the world shook hands and had a gentleman's agreement to not try that again. Many nations in Europe eventually created anti-hate speech laws, but the state generally did not actively pursue fascist groups. They were essentially allowed under the protection of liberal democracy. Germany banned public admiration of the Nazi Party, but the state did not ban the concept of fascism. How could it? Fascists love pretending they are not fascists until it's time to do a fascism. Their obscurantism is their greatest weapon. The solution was clear: anti-fascism. Opposition to fascism was conducted, not surprisingly, by anti-fascists. Those who live in the United States might not realize this, but Antifa is nothing new. It persisted everywhere, even in the United States, but without as much media attention. Those who oppose anti-fascist organizing often claim that the prominence of fascism in the first half of the 20th century was never repeated, making anti-fascism unnecessary, but they have it backwards. The prominence of fascism was never repeated because of anti-fascist organizing. It was necessary before the war, necessary after the war, and necessary now. Why then, you might ask, has the world begun to flirt with fascism again? To answer that, we need to take our pointed and focused criticism of fascism as a dogma and our criticism of fascism in the 20th century and zoom out even further to see its causes. Fascism is not just racism with a paramilitary wing or nationalism with extra steps. There are common predictors of fascism, prerequisite conditions that usually must be met for a fascist movement to emerge in a nation. Some of the following history lesson is going to be pretty 101, but guess what? If you already know this, then this part is just for the people who want to know what you know. Here we go. In economic terms, the changing world of the last few centuries transformed modes of production and the particulars of class, but the stratification of these economic classes and the demarcations between the classes were no less apparent. After the late 15th century discovery of what Europeans called the New World, a new age of imperialism and colonialism was set into motion. Imperialism is the extension of a nation's rule over another nation through hard power, and colonialism is the creation of permanent settlements or takeover of existing permanent settlements to exploit the people and resources of another nation. Imperialism and colonialism were, and still are, practiced by the state. Mercantilism was practiced by merchant traders. Again, all these terms are interrelated as both state actors and non-state actors were involved. Mercantilism channeled enormous wealth to the few. The new capital was eventually used by the wealthy to, among other things, invest in private ownership of enterprise and hire wage laborers to create but not own the products of their labor. Those who invest this capital are capitalists, and the system of private ownership of the means of production is capitalism. Workers sell their labor as their only commodity to capitalists. Labor, much like any commodity, is valued at its determined price. However, labor is unlike any other commodity because it has the ability to produce value well beyond what is necessary for its own reproduction. The difference between the value a worker produces and the value of the consumption of goods necessary to sustain the worker is called its surplus value. Workers produce commodities the value of which is vastly unequal to the value of the wages they receive. Instead, they produce up to the point that the commodities are equal to the value of the wages, and the rest of their production, the rest of their labor, is effectively free. Under wage labor, it is impossible for a worker to ever recoup the value of their labor. The surplus value that capitalists take from their workers becomes their profit, and in a cruel twist, these profits serve to strengthen capitalists further. Wages do not necessarily increase as the capitalist gains more profit, because if the capitalist gains more wealth while the workers do not, the capitalist is in an even better position to negotiate lower wages, not higher wages. This mandatory appropriation of value is called exploitation, because even if the worker agrees to these terms, this agreement is under duress. Workers cannot opt out of capitalism, making their wage labor compulsory under the threat of poverty or death. The extreme wealth of capitalists compared to the complete lack of capital from the workers created a power imbalance that left workers with no other option but to work for the wage set exclusively by capitalists, and under the conditions set exclusively by capitalists. In the 19th century, the promise of the now faded Enlightenment era in Europe had gone unfulfilled. For example, in 1830, when the French revolted, as they were known to do, and removed Charles X, he was merely replaced by Louis Philippe. As king, he had the support of capitalists, and they worked in tandem to prevent France from becoming a republic and organizing its labor. This blockade against both reform and revolution was common across Europe. According to William A. Pelz, author of A People's History of Modern Europe, Europe stayed, if not quiet, mostly subdued by the old regimes of order, as evident in the revolts within Italy and Germany that were quickly reduced to oblivion. One notable exception were the Poles, who rose up bravely against the Russian Tsar, only to be brutally crushed and to watch another part of Poland disappear into the vastness of the Russian Empire. Class conflict was no longer only between peasants and lords, commoners and kings, but a more elaborate interrelation of private ownership of the means of production by the wealthy, wage laborers and tradesmen who operated under this compulsory system, and the state that sided with business interests in a gamesmanship of manipulation. Feudalism could not last forever, but it was not replaced by some egalitarian economic system as one might hope or even suspect based on the progression of society toward more egalitarian social values. Instead, feudalism was slowly substituted for capitalism, not as social progress but as an economic shift, with power continuously maintained in a vertical hierarchy, but with the people facing a new and unexpected hardship. Labor now had to contend not only with the state, but with a ruling economic elite that controlled labor more directly than before. A lower class uprising against the state, for example, would be opposed by non-state actors with an economic interest in keeping the lower class from attaining greater recognition, and a lower class labor dispute would be crushed by the state for its competing interests. Capitalism created a ceiling on egalitarianism. This far, no further. In short, capitalism is the result of the exploitation of the New World and consequently exists to this day to exploit. As revolution was stymied by the partnership between capitalists and the state, wage laborers were forced to find new ways to protect themselves. If the capitalists owned their wages and the state authorities owned their freedom, the only weapon in their arsenal was numbers, solidarity. Laborers, trade unionists, socialists, and anarchists joined together for a united front against the changing shape of economics. Capitalists and the state engaged in a strategy of harassment, intimidation, strike-breaking, and violence to keep the workers exclusively in service of profits instead of their own interests and concerns. In response, workers organized across borders to form the International Working Men's Association, now more commonly called the First International. The police actively repressed the First International, committing undercover operations and intimidation. The First International only lasted until 1876. A Second International emerged in 1889, but was split apart in the wake of World War I, beginning in 1914. A public school social studies explanation of the origins of World War I often comes in the form of the powder keg lesson, in which a single event forced the hands of various reluctant nations into honoring their sworn alliances that were signed in good faith. However, a more complete picture of World War I is that of competing nation-states vying for new territory and resources, encouraged in part by the interests of capitalists. War is a great boon to capitalism. Imperialism is the inevitable outcome of an economic system that demands unlimited exponential growth within the paradoxical limits of the borders of a nation-state. Without imperialism, capitalism has limits. Because capitalism cannot have limits, imperialism is inevitable. As explained in War and the International, the forces of production which capitalism has evolved have outgrown the limits of nation and state. The national state, the present political form, is too narrow for the exploitation of these productive forces. The natural tendency of our economic system, therefore, is to seek to break through the state boundaries. The whole globe, the land and the sea, the surface as well as the interior has become one economic workshop, the different parts of which are inseparably connected with each other. This work was accomplished by capitalism. The Second International was expected to oppose the war. However, the German Social Democratic Party betrayed the International and sided with the state. World War I had tremendous lasting effects in the conflict between capitalism and the people. It consolidated economic and territorial power for the victors, split apart the Second International due to infighting, and was one of the contributing factors that led to the 1917 Russian Revolution. Germany was forced to take responsibility for the war, despite the origins being far more complex. Germany gave up massive territorial concessions and took on a debt of 132 billion marks. That was approximately $31.4 billion in 1918, but it might be best understood as $422 billion in 2022. This debt was imposed to put limits on Germany's power, both its military and its economy, in hopes of removing Germany as a competitor in both. This did not exactly work. Before the war, some nations, such as France, paid for the costly expense of warfare through taxes. Germany, perhaps not wishing to upset business interests with new taxes, paid for the war largely through borrowing money. Following the war, Germany now had its more conventional debt to pay off and the War Guilt Clause debt, reparations. Still unwilling to tax the rich, capitalists and the state conspired with the Reichsbank. In 1921, they developed a plan to destroy the German currency to simultaneously reduce the reparations and control the workers. In the beginning of 1922, $1 was the equivalent of 7,400 marks. Toward the end of 1923, $1 was the equivalent of 60 million marks. Hyperinflation. The German state was unable to make reparations, but that was the point. German capitalists were protected from this devaluation of the mark because their transactions were conducted with gold or through barter. They still made out like bandits. The German workers, of course, were not so lucky. They were paid in now worthless paper. Cost of living skyrocketed, and their poverty limited their bargaining power in negotiating wages. Again, that was the point. Income inequality was on the rise everywhere, particularly in the United States. In 1923, the top 0.1% of income earners in the US held 15% of the wealth. Not the 1%, the 0.1%. By 1929, the top 0.1% held a staggering 25% of the wealth. The economy produced more than it consumed because the people did not have enough income. Speculators purchased land with a small down payment of 10% with the promise of paying the 90% later, but these speculators instead sold the land on the rising market. Speculators bought stock for a similar low payment of 10% with 90% borrowed from brokers. According to Alex Grant, editor at Fightback, another trick was the formation of investment trust corporations. These entities produced no tangible products. Instead, with a relatively small amount of seed capital, they invested in other companies. However, there was nothing to stop investment trusts from investing in other investment trusts in a circular process of creating value from nothing. Those buying on margin were totally uninterested in production. They were attempting to live the ultimate capitalist dream of creating money from money without all the headaches of actually having to employ workers or do anything useful. This behavior is not the abuse of capitalism. It is capitalism. Capitalism incentivizes this behavior. It incentivizes unlimited growth. It incentivizes taking advantage of the system because there are significantly more advantages to this than there are consequences. And no amount of regulation can ever entirely contain an economic system that is explicitly designed to do this. In 1929, the world began to suffer through the Great Depression, and as bad as the United States was hit, a nation like Germany, whose workers were already desperately poor, was hit harder. Prior to the stock market crash, Germany borrowed millions of dollars from the United States, and after the stock market crashed, the US demanded repayment. When confronted with economic collapse, politicians and the wealthy banded together. Economic collapse also has a profound effect on immigration, with workers traveling to find employment. When the workers have lost everything, crushed under the boot of an economic system, they search for answers. They understand the economy from their anecdotal perspective, not the broader global market or the minutiae of capitalist machinations. The people ask the politicians what to think, not because they necessarily trust politicians or out of some inherent naivete, but because of the state-enforced apathy of representative democracy. The people elect representatives so that these representatives can do all the thinking and the people can go about their lives. People want to make decisions in their own lives, but not be bothered to make decisions affecting others. Thus, when the politicians speak, this state-enforced apathy subconsciously convinces the people that politicians might not know best, but might know better than themselves. The only other alternative is to pay closer attention to politics and the economy. Politicians are in competition with one another, and the people sometimes have party options, but often politicians all say the same thing.
We should all agree the answer is not to defund the police, it's to fund the police. Fund them. Fund them.
And when politicians do not agree, particularly on cultural wedge issues, this competition breeds division, a lack of solidarity among the working people, which is precisely what they want. When the people are facing economic disaster under capitalism, and they ask who is responsible, the politicians say, "It's not our fault. We have been betrayed by the global community, stabbed in the back." Then they frame a patsy and place a knife in his hand. The people then turn to the news media for confirmation, but the media is owned by capitalists. The capitalists, by way of the media, say, "It's not our fault either. It's the communists scheming against us. The foreigners stealing the jobs promised to you at birth. The lesser people who don't care for our glorious nation." People are told by every authority in their nation that the material conditions are the fault of convenient scapegoats, because the only other option is the truth. Acknowledging the truth would consequently result in society taking meaningful steps to transform our economy, potentially abandoning capitalism altogether, and capitalists will not allow that. Capitalists are comfortable watching the world burn if they can warm themselves by the fire. When faced with inevitable economic crisis under capitalism, the left-right divide of egalitarianism and hierarchy comes into conflict. Society can either choose to recognize the cause of the crisis and revolt, or ignore the cause of the crisis and subsequently manufacture a cause. Scapegoats, like immigrants stealing jobs, ethnic minorities allegedly wanting handouts, religious minorities scheming in the dark, ever-changing sexual norms and gender norms that rob the nation of a robust character needed to get the job done. A scapegoat must be something easily identifiable, not something more invisible like the economy, something superficial, something that people can spot walking down the sidewalk, something that can be attacked. As the people zero in on their scapegoats, a desire for older, traditional hierarchies begins to grow among people already predisposed to right-wing hierarchical thinking, as well as many people in the center. Conservatism is based in caution, and caution is based in fear. When people are afraid, they retreat. In this case, their retreat is into the past. The future is unknown, but the past is always there, laid out in the disinformation of our history books, sung in our state-endorsed anthems, and half-remembered as more pure, more wholesome, a mythic past that never existed. If things were better before this downturn, they reason, maybe something we did before would help. This is a proposal not by the people at large, but by those in power or those who wish to take power. An idea forms to justify this unjustifiable reasoning, as if returning to previous antiquated traditional hierarchies will save the economy, the nation, and the sanctity of their families. It is a false, spurious correlation that nonetheless feels real to those who favor myth to reality, an easy answer from the top to anyone predisposed to hierarchical thinking on the bottom, activated by measurable, quantifiable conditions ushered in by a series of devastating events, exploited by a charismatic strongman to whom the people can attach themselves, manipulated by politicians and business interests, and taken to monstrous, inhuman extremes. And that's how fascism happens. Even before the Nazis took power, capitalists supported the Nazi Party. Capitalists enlisted Nazis as their private army against the threat of unified labor, the threat to their economic interests. The Nazi Party was supported by the major enterprises in Germany. Fritz Thyssen, the industrial tycoon and the owner of United Steelworks, was an early supporter of the Nazi Party. The Nazis had funding from the man who controlled, at one point, more than 75% of Germany's iron ore reserves. Capitalists want a monopoly, not to share profits, and Thyssen feared organized labor more than he feared the Nazis. The Nazi Party had further backing from Emil Kirchdorf, a coal industry tycoon, as well as support from foreign capitalists like Sir Henry Detterding, oil, and Henry Ford, automobiles. With this backing, they were able to buy out the taverns frequented by left-wing groups, mobilize with greater strength, and spend money on political campaigns to seize power. Why did business interests support fascism even before the Nazis took power? Because capitalism favors hierarchy. It favors the right, even the far right. The left favors egalitarianism, the interests of workers. For capitalists, fascism is simply in their best economic interests. Let's move outside of Germany and examine things more broadly. These bigotries existed before capitalism and can exist independent of capitalism. However, capitalism takes advantage of these bigotries to reduce solidarity and to exploit marginalized people for profit. The ideas surrounding bigotries can spring from any number of sources, but discriminatory policies come from positions of power. According to Professor Ibram X. Kendi, author of Stamped from the Beginning, racially discriminatory policies have usually sprung from economic, political, and cultural self-interests that are constantly changing. Capitalists seeking to increase profit margins have primarily created and defended discriminatory policies out of economic self-interest. Capitalism did not originate these bigotries, but capitalism benefits from their enforcement, the enforcement of coercive hierarchies. Even without economic crisis, we often see the racial majority blame societal woes on the victims of capitalism instead of capitalists. Capitalism creates stratified economic hierarchies, class divide. Historically, these classes are often racialized to better exploit people for profit. Here's how. Those in the racial minority suffer from discrimination, generational poverty from the legacy of colonialism, geographic segregation, over-policing, mass incarceration, and other methods that continue the exploitation of minorities even after some historical reforms. These methods result in minorities having less institutional support and, therefore, less recourse to defend against capitalist exploitation. Economic classes become racialized. A disproportionate amount of the racial majority becomes the middle class and upper class, and a disproportionate amount of the racial minority becomes the lower class. If there is an economic downturn, the racialized lower class is blamed for being forced to accept low wages, allegedly bringing down property values. A combination of this planned economic desperation and purposeful underfunding of racialized lower-class neighborhoods invariably creates some low-level crime as a community survival tactic. Those in a higher economic class who benefit from capitalism subsequently blame crime on the victims of capitalism. Even though financial disparity and crime are products of these stratified economic classes, the racial majority often consolidates among racial lines instead of class lines. This creates a baseless resentment among the racial majority in the middle class, as well as those in the racial majority in the lower class, who harbor this resentment for not receiving all the benefits of being in the racial majority. This engenders a racist belief that the economic downturn is the fault of either inherent racial inferiority or cultural inferiority, instead of economics. Capitalism is a hierarchy and therefore must always enforce economic inequality, but then, to maximize exploitation, it enforces social inequality as well. It's not a secret plot or a conspiracy of the few, it's just how capitalism works. Again, this more common bigotry exists before economic crisis, but during an economic crisis, well, it gets much worse. When capitalism inevitably reaches crisis, and the people become desperate enough to abandon it altogether for a new economic system, capitalism then fuses with manufactured right-wing reactionary social politics. Fascism emerges as a defense mechanism, a defense of capitalism. Oppression is an intersection, not a reduction, and viewing oppression exclusively in terms of class is unhelpful. Oppression must be viewed intersectionally. Capitalism is not the direct singular cause of fascism. Capitalist crisis is more like the fuel to the already existing fire. So, why is this happening again? Fascism is on the rise because similar conditions and prerequisites for early 20th century fascism have largely been fulfilled in the 21st century. As explained by sociology professor William I. Robinson, fascism is a particular response to capitalist crisis. A fight back against the global police state, and 21st century fascism must involve broad anti-fascist alliances led by popular and working class forces. Now, what does all that mean? Post-World War II Western powers engaged in a project of global hegemony and reactionary counter-revolution against a threat to global capitalism. Western powers overthrew governments, assassinated leaders, all in the name of capitalist domination. Much of this was conducted by the United States in service of worldwide hegemony. Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, can create a fierce nationalism and violent resentment among those subjected to it. In the beginning of the 21st century, the United States was attacked, the motive predominantly related to U.S. foreign policy. As a consequence, nationalism in the U.S. also grew, and the U.S. engaged in a project of expansion into the Middle East to secure long sought-after economic interests in the region. This was propagandized as the War on Terror. Nationalism on the rise, xenophobia on the uptick, and a new scapegoat for all our woes had been established: Muslims. The various interrelated wars in the Middle East and nearby regions resulted in a tremendous amount of displacement. Refugees with nowhere else to go traveled to Europe and North America to find a new home, into the arms of the Western powers that contributed to their displacement in the first place. A rapid influx of immigration stokes xenophobia and nationalism, and if the refugees and immigrants are of a different race or religion, xenophobia and nationalism can skyrocket. The pieces on the board had been set. The 2008 economic crash created the largest crisis of capitalism since the Great Depression. The requisite economic crisis for a rise in fascism was set into motion. In the United States, the election of the first black president was seen as a victory against racism, but it also created a newfound racist reactionary movement. A weapon used against him was the conspiracy theory that he was a secret Muslim, and therefore an existential threat to the security of the nation and the purity of the nation. The Syrian civil war broke out in 2011, and the major powers in the world invested in different sides, escalating the conflict into a series of proxy wars in a now divided nation. This led to significantly more refugees. The internet gave rise to new reactionary social movements and provided a safe place for fascists to develop their networks. Right on cue, fascist political parties and charismatic strongmen appeared. Authoritarians who openly described themselves as nationalists. The Overton window of acceptability had shifted. Political violence at campaign rallies became the norm, and the capitalist media invested in its coverage. Muslims and immigrants in general were targeted both in rhetoric and policy proposals. Fascist recruitment exploded, mainstreaming what was thought only a few years prior to be simply beyond the pale. Little was done because the elections were all done within the system. No matter how faulty, how worthless, and how corrupt the system is, when the activity is done within it, people shrug their shoulders and state-endorsed apathy sets in. In the 1920s and 1930s, anti-fascist organizing was born from the labor movement, unionists, communists, anarchists, but it's 2022. In the United States, union busting has destroyed most of the unions across the board. Communism and anarchism have been completely marginalized in Western nations where fascism so frequently takes root. Where are the anti-fascists supposed to come from now? In 2022, anti-fascism can be militant but not a militia. Anti-fascism is now activism, and that might be enough if there were more activists. With the state unwilling to help, and without union power as a counterbalance, large-scale anti-fascist activity is required, as it historically always has been. The only advantage we have is numbers, but if we wait too long, the numbers on the other side of this will shore up faster. We all intuitively understand the need to help our neighbors and our neighborhoods, so why don't we? What do people get wrong about Antifa, and why are they getting it wrong? Well, you see, there are two Antifas. There's the real Antifa, community defense, and what I can only call all caps Antifa, the Antifa that does not exist. A cartoon caricature of anti-fascism. A centralized terrorist organization that only operates in the minds of 50-year-old white men who watch Tucker Carlson tonight. Antifa is anti-fascist organizing, but all caps Antifa is burning down our cities. Right-wing media accomplishes this through misdirection. It labels things that are not Antifa as Antifa. It works like this. A man sets a car on fire. The man is not a member of one of the few small autonomous anti-fascist organizations. He may not even have strong feelings about fascism or anti-fascism, so he is not even ideologically Antifa either. He might have been there to protest a grave injustice. Or maybe he just hates cars as much as he loves fire. Who knows? Then a right-wing pundit says, "Look what this Antifa thug did." The crime happens, the suspect is arrested, or at least recorded, and is then given honorary membership in all caps Antifa. Anti-fascist activity is a response to fascism. If the alleged crime has little or nothing to do with fascism, then we should not assume it is being perpetrated by an actual anti-fascist group or even in the name of anti-fascism. If someone cuts you off in traffic, it's not Antifa, because what you were doing and what they were doing has nothing to do with fascism. Antifa did not loot a Walmart, because looting a Walmart is not an explicitly anti-fascist activity, although it is extremely cool. Right-wing media has concluded, without evidence, that Antifa is behind it all, or at least predominantly responsible. First of all, no cities have been burned down, and Arby's has been burned down. It's unfortunate when there is collateral damage in a protest or a riot that causes property damage to a small business, but these instances are far more rare than right-wing media would have you believe. Some people can be hurt during protests and riots, but the vast majority of those injured are the participants themselves, and they are injured by the police. A riot in response to police violence, racialized poverty, or some other form of institutionalized racism is a conflict between the people and the state. It is obviously not a conflict between the people and themselves. The recent riots were not instigated or conducted by Antifa outside agitators, and they were conducted mostly through spontaneous, informal activism from within their own communities. You know why I think these guys are fascists? Because they subscribe to fascist beliefs and outwardly wear the colors and wave the flags of their neo-fascist organizations. I'm not just guessing based on no evidence. This mislabeling of Antifa happens all the time before the fact-checkers come in, but people don't always remember the fact-check. They remember the original headline. Remember when the right tried to blame the Capitol insurrection on Antifa? It doesn't matter that it was completely debunked in less than 24 hours. People who want to believe it will form a compartmentalized memory of the incident. Almost every well-circulated video showing Antifa violence has been debunked, proven to show activity out of context, clipped to hide the accountability of fascists, presented as an attack instead of self-defense, or labeled Antifa without any cause. That's why you see these clips on social media and presented by pundits who traffic in white nationalism, but typically not from a comparatively more credible outlet. That's not to say that our capitalist journalism apparatus is good and noble. It's just that actual journalists have to do at least some fact-checking to protect themselves from accusations of erroneous journalism and to protect the outlet from lawsuits. Tucker Carlson can get away with this because his people have admitted in court that what he does is not journalism. Major outlets love sensationalism, and if any of this were real, they would run with it more often. But it's not real, so they don't. Mostly these fake stories get spread on Facebook, and conservatives accept them as gospel. Did you hear that 6 police officers in 10 days were murdered during the George Floyd riots in June 2020? Well, that did not happen. They died of natural causes during those days or incidents unrelated to Black Lives Matter protesters. Did you hear that Antifa was going to take what's ours from the white suburbs? That did not happen either. Did you hear that thousands upon thousands of Antifa thugs were arrested for violent crimes at protests? That did not happen either, and not only because there is no evidence that those arrested were Antifa, but because nearly everyone arrested was charged with non-violent crimes. If you spring a curfew on people, effectively making even peaceful protest a crime, then all of a sudden everyone is a criminal. Imagine that. Did you hear that a 2019 mass shooting in Dayton, Ohio was done by Antifa? Well, you heard wrong, as a comprehensive FBI probe found absolutely nothing of the sort. It was not even inspired by Antifa. Did you hear that Black Lives Matter and/or Antifa murdered 36 people and injured thousands more and caused $8 billion in property damage? For all the bonus money, is it true? No, the numbers were completely made up. Anti-fascism is informal, spontaneous organizing, and formal, small, autonomous organizing. All caps Antifa, the scary domestic terrorist organization haunting America, does not exist. Even the Federal Bureau of Investigation has admitted this. The FBI has a long history of going after left-wing organizations that they believe are threats to the sanctity of the United States. If even the FBI, under the Donald Trump administration no less, can't make the case that all caps Antifa exists, then what does that tell you? Perhaps the size, scale, and formal membership of violent far-right groups like the Proud Boys have convinced people that there must exist a similarly large and similarly violent entity on the left. However, a small autonomous anti-fascist group without centralized leadership like Rose City Antifa has membership in the dozens at most, whereas the Proud Boys have chapters and a centralized leadership. Their membership was estimated to be 6,000 in 2017 and has undoubtedly grown since. Exact numbers today are hard to come by, Every study of terrorism has independently confirmed that the vast majority of terroristic violence is committed by far-right extremists or religious extremists. Religious extremists, from Christian abortion clinic bombers to Al-Qaeda, are almost always also right-wing due to their fundamentalist dogma and rigid hierarchies. Left-wing terrorism exists, but it barely exists, at least by comparison. This is because the left organizes differently and has different goals. The left is historically more responsible for people's revolutions, not attacks on the people. I once had an argument with someone about this. He said that he hated fascism, but also wasn't too keen on anti-fascism because he didn't want people running around wearing masks. What are you, J. Jonah Jameson? And I was like, okay, then work towards ending fascism, because that will end both fascism and the thing that only arises to fight fascism, anti-fascism. And he was like, yeah, I'll do that, I'll get to work. And I was like, that work is anti-fascism. As more and more information comes out about the insurrection on January 6th, 2021, the more challenging it is to claim that it was a mere spontaneous action that got out of hand. Fascism has both formal and informal actors. Many present were informal, but many were formal fascists with very specific, violent goals. Major figures in fascist groups and right-wing militias have been charged, including the leader of the Oath Keepers, Stuart Rhodes, and the chairman of the Proud Boys, Henry Enrique Theriault. In the case of Theriault, he was first charged and convicted on weapons charges and burning a Black Lives Matter banner that the Proud Boys stole from a church, but then shortly after serving his sentence, he was charged with conspiracy related to the insurrection. There is so much evidence connecting the leadership of fascist groups with prominent politicians, not the least of which was the President of the United States at the time. The insurrection had little chance of successfully overturning the election by force. It wasn't Trump's ascent to Nazi chancellor, it was more like his beer hall putsch. A failed coup, a phony trial, a biased panel of judges, and consequences that may have helped recruit more people than it turned away. Trump's undoing was not his lack of will or his lack of fascist tendencies, but his lack of competence. But now, over a year later, he probably has a better understanding of where the levers of power are, and should he regain power, he won't surround himself with anyone connected to the establishment. He won't have anyone near him that would be willing to perform mild sabotage or refuse his military orders. He will surround himself exclusively with far-right loyalists and out-and-proud fascists. Trump losing the election did not end fascism in the United States or elsewhere in the world, but Trump winning in 2024 could accelerate the rise of fascism to the threshold only seen in the 1930s. Now you might be thinking, well, the best we can do is vote. The best we can do is try to nominate a good candidate for the Democrats and hope they will finally, at long last, fight hard and have our best interests at heart. And to that I say, are you kidding me? Yes, vote, okay. But the Democratic Party is not going to shut down fascist organizing. They are a political party, and fascist organizing is street level. We're in the streets. It's up to us. If nothing else has convinced you about the necessity of anti-fascist organizing, this should. The defense of our communities cannot be left exclusively to the care of the Democratic Party.
Gentlemen, this is Democracy Manifest. See that chap over there? He's got your hand off my penis! This is the one who got me on the penis thing before.
Whenever I write about a systemic problem or a massive issue that would be impossible to fix overnight, Someone listens to my argument and says, "So, what's the alternative? I noticed that you don't have a 3-step solution to this problem." Yes, maybe I should be more prescriptive than descriptive, but the solution is usually the same. So here goes. Organize. Find an issue that you want fixed, search for an organization in your area or nationally that focuses on that issue, join that organization. How's that for 3 steps? Can we turn off capitalism by flicking the capitalism switch? No. So the solution is to organize, either in pre-existing anti-capitalist activist groups, unions, or by developing our own. Can we elect a completely different way of life into office? No, so we organize and develop a political counterbalance that could one day usher in a completely different way of life. And now, to the topic at hand, can we stop fascism by asking it to stop? No, so we organize. That is the solution. We need to be in significantly greater numbers confronting fascism, because it should now be abundantly clear that a shocking number of people living in the United States has bought into it at least on some level. It is now a mainstream political talking point to say that the most obvious movement toward fascism in modern history is being conducted by patriots. We let that start to feel normal too quickly, didn't we? Politicians are not your friends, and they're not going to do the right thing out of the goodness of their hearts. They were bought a long time ago. They have been convinced that their purchase was only the system operating normally, and if they agree with the system, then this normal operation of favors for favors and legalized bribery is also good. The end result of asking representative politicians to do all the thinking for us is apathy. The end result of utilizing our collective power is change. Therefore, the solution is not apathy. The solution is organizing. Historically speaking, big changes happen when people show up. If you don't want to do any of this, I understand. That's your call. I'm not trying to shame anyone for living their life, and the limits on our time make organizing challenging for many of us. But there is no sense continuing to pretend that a solution has not been offered. The time to organize in greater numbers was years ago, but that does not necessarily mean it's too late. We must refuse to give up. Changing the world only requires the will to do it. Hi everyone. This video took a very long time to make. I would appreciate it if you would consider subscribing to my channel and checking out my Patreon link. Bye for now.